Hello, everyone. My name is Carmen Valero. I'm originally from Spain, Madrid, and I currently work in a Spanish immersion program here in Moorhead, Minnesota. And my compañera is...
My name is Maddie Winnicky, and I'm a Spanish teacher at a high school in Hastings, Minnesota. And so, as an elementary teacher and a high school teacher, we are excited to explore this question with you. Have you ever thought about developing intercultural communicative competency activities in your language classroom? We're excited to share our ideas and hear yours.
In our presentation, we're going to talk about these 4 main points. What is intercultural communicative competence? Why is it important to develop it in our language classrooms? How does it look in different contexts, elementary and secondary? And the most important point, we want to hear your ideas. How have you developed this communicative competence in your classroom? Let's start our presentation with this quote. We need to create learning experiences that lead students to go outside in order to discover what's inside. In other words, we use in our language classrooms, we use the language as a vehicle for communication and to also understand and experience the cultures that speaks that language. But at the same time, we are now realizing that our students are also gaining insights of their own culture and of their own language. And they are also being more aware of how interconnected we are locally, nationally, and internationally. So let's start first with the meaning, the definition of this intercultural communicative competence. In the recent years, there has been a lot of disagreements trying to find the perfect meaning for this concept. There have been many authors like Veram, Dirford, even the Inca model, the European Inca model, trying to discover, trying to find out that meaning. We came up with elements that all of those definitions have in common. For us, intercultural communicative competence applies to anyone who possesses attitudes, behaviors, and awareness to interact with people from different cultural backgrounds and communicates thoughts and ideas using the language in a proficient and effective way. In other words, we want our students to become a person, basically, who can go through unfamiliar territories, trying to explore those cultures, those different ways of thinking, ways of doing things, but also in a growing sense of being comfortable, and also curiosity.
And so to illustrate that, we've included these 2 images. One is from Byram, and Byram has this whole intercultural competence model that Carmen and I first learned about together as our introduction to this topic. And he includes these tenets of intercultural communicative competence. So you have knowledge, skills of interpreting and listening, attitudes of curiosity and openness, skills of discovery and interaction, and then in the middle, critical cultural awareness. And then maybe a more simple way of just illustrating where does intercultural communicative competence fit in language teaching. It's at the intersection of language proficiency and cultural competence. And I think as language teachers, we often easily see in our curriculum and in our, especially in traditional language teaching, where both language and culture have a place, but to truly intersect them is the goal, and that's what we're exploring today.
So we as language teachers, we also thinking about at what point should schools, teachers start intentionally developing this competence in our students. So based on the research by Demarca Sparks, and as an early age of 6 months, infants can notice skin color differences. At the age of 2, children notice and ask questions about those differences and similarities among people. And just a year after, they become more aware of the social stereotypes, feelings, and ideas about other people. So every single message that they hear, they are making in themselves, they're making their own assumptions and prejudices about other people. So for example, I would like to share with you something that occurred to me doing just grocery shop. There was a mom and a daughter in front of me, and then there was another person crossing by, and the daughter said the mom, "Wow, mom, look at her skin color, it's darker than mine." And the mom said, "Isn't it beautiful?" So messages like that, positive messages like that, it will help kids basically to understand that differences are okay. It's gonna be part of their normality of their daily life. Because at the age of 7 and at the age of 9, they've already created their own stereotypes about people. And they won't change that stereotype till something really happens in their lives. So for us, we know that our students will not get that proficiency in the language until understand and experience that cultural context when the language occurs. So for us, why it is important to develop this competence in young children? First of all, to create the figure of intercultural speakers in our societies. They can share ideas, they can share thoughts, and actually they will realize that those same ideas that they have, they're very connected to other ideas from other cultures as well. Second, to avoid cultural misunderstandings, we keep hearing stereotypes from other cultures. Is it fair for everyone who is coming from the same culture? We don't think so. And then third, to enable young children to shape their own awareness with positive attitudes, as well as develop cross-cultural understanding and respect to others. So here becomes some examples that we would like to provide you with from both different contexts. We have the elementary context and high school context, and we hope you enjoy them. A good way, and also an easy way to embed some cultural activities is using a thematic unit tool. It will help you to include those cultural activities along that they're gonna be tied and along with your standards that you need to teach as well in your classroom languages, especially if you're coming from an immersion program. And these thematics units will help you to develop meaningful activities and essential questions that connects local and familiar experience with a global experience to explore those similarities and differences. And please have in mind that any cultural activities that you are including in your classroom has to be related to children's daily life. And here are some examples of those cultural activities. The first that I love is through read-alouds, how you can include some part of the culture from different cultures into your classroom. You can definitely use multiple cultural books. One book that I love in my classroom is about this character. Her name is Carmelita. So Carmelita walks through her neighborhood, and then she greets different people that live in her own neighborhood. And she realized that everyone actually speaks a different language. And then she's learning those languages as well, because she wants to be her friends. Also, I have another idea. In my travels, anytime that I have the opportunity to travel somewhere who speaks Spanish, I bring authentic books and stuffed animals, because it will provide that authenticity into my language classroom. So I kind of collect a wide variety of cultural books as well. And other ways of including cultural activities in your classroom is just through play. Those are experiences that encourage children to use connections to create personal relationships with unfamiliar cultural practices and languages that would not be possible through other kinds of interactions. For example, they can build a Maya pyramid and we can talk about it. You can also do, for example, an altar and talk about Dia de los Muertos with your classroom and why there are still people out there that believe in this practice. Also, you can introduce popular games that other kids are playing and finding those similarities with the plays and the games that your students are playing in their daily life. Also, through cooking, why don't you have your students play with Play-Doh and pretend they're cooking something related to those countries? And even a map, just introducing a map. A map is very simple to present to your students, hey, there are more people out there that speak the same language you are learning. And here I have another example for you. It was a virtual field trip. So we did it through different steps, and absolutely it was an engaging and learning experience for my students. So the first step was introducing the different culture through a letter. Someone from that country sent us a letter inviting us to visit his neighborhood. Then as a whole classroom, we create a list, a kind of an itinerary of our adventure. And then I incorporated in our steps, in our second step, I incorporated Google Maps. So I wanted to show my student actually where this kid is from and how far is it from us. As well as using Google Build, we create our itinerary and embedding some YouTube videos that give those visuals to my students. And at the end, the step 3, it is really important to have your students to reflect about that experience. So for example, my students reflect first about similarities and differences between the buildings. Also, they reflect what was the most important part for them, and also what they learned actually, where are the takeaways from this experience. And some of you might think, okay, reading and writing, it is easy, right, to implement those cultural activities to develop this competence. What about other areas, other content areas such as math, art, music? We can do it as well and just take easy steps. For example, one of my standards, my kindergarten standard, was identifying shapes in real world. So what a beautiful idea. I included Gaudi paintings and Gaudi art, Gaudi architecture in my classroom, so kids had to identify those shapes on those in those pictures. So that is another way, and I'm sure you come up with different ideas in your classroom as well. And we're gonna talk about what you can do also from your local area. Sometimes we don't have the opportunity to include more cultural activities, but what you can encourage your students to do as in a personal experience, building relationships with members of other cultural groups. And we are providing you here with some ideas. For example, exchange letters, emails, find a pen pal. And here you can see some examples that I did that my students did with another classroom from Spain. My compañera Mari, do you have another example?
Yeah, and at the high school level, the exchanging letters is something you can easily do over maybe physical letters or email. I know I found one time another Spanish teacher, and we had our students exchange email addresses and then they sent emails to each other. And it was so fun to see how students' motivation and engagement just went super high when they were knowing that their audience was a real person. And one of them even thought that they were going to find the love of their life over this pen pal exchange, which didn't happen, but it adds another layer to their cultural understanding for sure.
Another idea could be just spending some periods of time abroad. And I believe high school does, college does too.
Yeah, we send a group of students every other year to a Spanish-speaking country for a week or two, and one part of that we always focus on is a homestay because I think that's a really integral part of staying abroad. A lot of my students and families talk about their interest in traveling to Spanish-speaking countries as a family or for a vacation, and I really challenge students to think that it's not enough just to go to Mexico and stay at an all-inclusive resort to learn about culture and use your language. You really need to get out of your comfort zone and talk to people and ask questions and learn that way. But it's a really good experience if students can make that happen.
And sometimes we might not have the opportunity to travel abroad, but we are still encouraging our students to connect to someone from their own neighborhood who speaks a different language. And then I can explain my example. When I first came to the United States, I found out people out there who was interested in learning my language, and I was interested to learn their language, English.
And a lot of students in my community aren't even aware of the number of people or the people around them that speak a different language. And so, like, getting beyond sometimes their fear or uncertainty of speaking to a person in a different language, getting beyond that is so valuable because they can, like we're saying, build a relationship and learn about language and culture together.
And another idea is using the internet as a tool. For example, Flipgrid, Twitter. I'm sure your district has access into these platforms.
Yeah, and I encourage my students to use social media in whatever way that interests them. So some of them really like the singer Alvaro Soler, and so I have them follow Alvaro Soler on TikTok and Instagram, and they really get to learn about that person or that cultural group or whatever it is from a different perspective in their own way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about and build off of some of the examples that Carmen gave about how this might look in a traditional high school context. And what I mean by traditional is like we start Spanish 1 in the 9th grade. So students are developmentally and cognitively pretty advanced by 9th grade or a later grade even, but they don't have the language. So linguistically, they're kind of on the same level as Carmen's students, and or even lower sometimes. And so I use products, practices, and perspectives, something called the image model, thematic units, like Carmen said, and intercultural communicative or communication statements. Something that I want to frame my ideas with that is constantly a challenge for me is finding balance in what is possible, because I often see the lofty goals of finding authentic audiences and finding real world community connections, and then balancing that with what I actually do in my classroom, which is sometimes nowhere near my ideal, but finding ways to balance the realistic ideas, like just using more backwards design with social justice issues in the essential question, or just integrating more of the image model in my day-to-day activities that I'm already doing, can make me feel a little bit more empowered and feel more successful in this area, even if it's baby steps. And anything that I can do in simple ways to shift from bringing the world into the classroom versus bringing the classroom into the world is something that I hold on to pretty closely. And the nice thing about this is it can work with so many kinds of curriculum. It works with content-based instruction, like Carmen at the immersion model. It works with comprehensible input, if that's more your style. For me and my school, we use more of a textbook curriculum, and there are ways to do it with that too. So I really like to frame everything around products, practices, and perspectives. And this is something that I've worked with my colleagues to integrate with our students and really get our students using this language over the past couple of years. And it kind of started with just introducing these these as concepts because a lot of students and a lot of traditional textbook curriculum, for example, introduces culture as pretty product heavy. And so I like to use the image of an iceberg with my students, and we do like focus note taking with this, but we talk about what are the things that you see and typically think about when you think of culture, and then understanding the depth that goes with that. So understanding the practices and perspectives are what we're getting students towards. So beyond that, since I've kind of been able to do that pretty successfully with my students, now I'm encouraging myself and you to take it a step further and integrate social justice issues with products, practices, and perspectives. So I found this quote at the bottom, or this paraphrased idea from Hall, to be really powerful and, again, a great challenge for us to examine schools and societies to identify processes that discriminate against diversity and increase efforts to teach language and culture across national boundaries. To me, that kind of encapsulates what we're doing with intercultural communicative competence. And to do that with products, practices, and perspectives, sometimes it's not enough just to say, here's the product, practice, and perspective. Sometimes we need to get at what are some products that not everyone has access to? What are some practices that maybe are contradictory or problematic? What are some perspectives that are less commonly taught? And so getting sort of a social justice lens on products, practices, and perspectives can make it even more effective and powerful when we're reaching towards intercultural communicative competence. How I have used products, practices, and perspectives in my teaching has been two kind of main ways, but sort of throughout I find other ideas as well. Our school has a big initiative on focused note-taking in the last couple of years. And so I have students take notes on identifying products, practices, and perspectives. And even the identification process for my, even my honors level 3 students is challenging for them. We do readings sometimes about culture from their textbook, and I use EMC or Carnegie Learning. And so one example of a reading we do is on Venezuelan baseball teams. And so students can pretty easily find products and sometimes practices from those readings, but their perspectives make them think a little bit deeper. And so something as a high school teacher that I'm always wanting more of is ways that I can use language and leverage language to get to higher level thinking. And with this perspectives, that adds an element of rigor that I didn't have before. Cultural experience projects are a project that we've done for a very long time at our school, and students each quarter complete a choice project. And there's tons of ideas. They can read books, they can listen to music, they can watch movies. One of them is to dine at a restaurant. And so for this project, I've fleshed out a little bit more to get students thinking beyond the products, beyond the food that they're eating at that restaurant, because typically that's what they talk about and that's what they remember is the food. But to think a little bit more about what they're seeing and how people are doing at the restaurant. Like, what languages are people speaking at the restaurant? How do people greet each other or interact, like even the servers at the restaurant? And who are the targeted clientele for the restaurant? Because sometimes it's really important for students to identify, is this a restaurant targeting tourists? Is this a restaurant for locals? And what does that mean? And then for the perspectives, it's even more challenging because they can't just make an observation and write it down. They need to think deeper. They need to ask questions. And sometimes they need to do some research to figure out, why are the products and practices that you listed evident at this restaurant? And what does that mean? Another way that's a pretty easy, more formative assessment style of developing intercultural communicative competence is through what is called the image model. And this is from Glisson-Donato's high leverage teaching practices. And it involves students together in a discourse community exploring culture. And what it starts off with is an image or a product or practice, and then an observation, analysis, a hypothesis, and then for exploring perspectives or reflecting further. And so again, you're typically getting from a product, and then you're working your way by asking questions and sort of inquiry to get to perspectives and reflection. two ways I really enjoy doing this. One is through Google Maps. I know Carmen talked about this in the virtual field trips idea, but I have just pulled up Street View on Google Maps on a topic that we're talking about, something that relates culturally to what we're talking about, or creating that sort of entrance into Google Maps. And then I go to Street View and students just start asking questions. It's like magic in a high school classroom. And it's hard sometimes to get students engaged in images, but when it's more interactive, when they feel like they can really step in that person's shoes, because Street View, you're seeing around, you're able to walk and move. It just gets them to ask so many questions, analyze, generate hypothesis. You don't even have to prompt them sometimes. And then that's where we start exploring perspectives. And maybe we do a little research around some of the hypotheses and questions they ask. Another example I've used with the image model is when we teach about Semana Santa, which is Holy Week in the spring, there are these capirotes, which are these like tall cone hats. And a lot of students, when they see the picture of these hats, make the connection that it looks like the KKK from the United States. And so we talk about how these products actually are both originating from the same source, which is in this lesson that I have, but they have different meanings and different perspectives. And then it gets into the complexity of how can you interpret the same product and the same practice from different perspectives, and then where does that leave us? What does that mean? And students use a lot of inquiry to explore that. Like Carmen said, backwards design and thematic units are a huge way to really holistically develop intercultural communicative competence. Because if we just try to do it in our day-to-day lesson planning, it's not going to be truly integrated. So I've linked here the Clementi unit template that, even though it's a long and extensive process, it really gets teachers to think through, what is my essential question? What are my issues that I'm looking for? And how does that integrate language and culture together? And then also through that, making sure we are incorporating the ACTFL can-do statements that are appropriate for that unit, and getting a variety of those standards in. And now those include intercultural competence, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Some powerful reflection questions that I think are really helpful guiding questions when we're developing units and revising our units are to get at, again, that social justice piece in our essential questions and in the summative assessments and interpretive tasks that we're asking students to do. So this was adapted from Glenn, Wesley, and Wessel from Words and Actions. Is there a history behind this cultural topic that might reveal past or present inequities? Are there accepted truths about this topic that can be challenged? Is this a topic that people from different groups might view differently? And so those are questions that really leverage higher level thinking, higher rigor in your lessons and units, which for a high school class, even if they're novice level, it's really important. And it gets at intercultural communicative competence. So two essential questions that I've used and just developed from more basic questions that my textbook curriculum has given me. In a unit on likes, dislikes, and personality traits, I've tried to integrate the vocabulary that we're already using in teaching, because I don't want to create a bunch of extra work for us, and the products, practices, and perspectives, which students are typically learning at the same time. And so I integrate those two by asking, what cultural products, practices, and perspectives reflect my identity? And they can use likes and dislikes and personality traits in Spanish to talk about that. And how do they influence my worldview? And as Carmen said, sometimes what's really necessary, along with using the language in a novice level, is the reflection piece. And that could be done sometimes in English for my students. A unit on places around a community, this stemmed from a vocabulary list that we typically use that talks about places of worship. So we have iglesia for church, sinagoga for synagogue, templo for temple, and mezquita for mosque. And so my students, some of them didn't know what a mosque and temple and synagogue are for. So we start that conversation, and then we talk about how in our community there's only churches, there's only iglesias. And what does that say about the values of our community members, and what does that mean, and is it equitable? And we have a whole conversation around that. So we want to end here a little bit with talking about these intercultural communication standards, because ACTFL revised these or added these more recently, and I didn't know about them until I started the process of preparing for this presentation. But they involve investigating products and perspectives to understand cultural perspectives, products and practices, and then interact with others in and from another culture. And you can see that they have novice to distinguished for each of these strands and can-do statements. So ways you could use these would be to have students reflect on the I can statements and track their own progress over time. You could use them as a rubric and include it in assessments. Something that's really key to my understanding of intercultural communicative competence is if you are integrating culture in your language, but you're not including it in your summative assessments, it's not truly intercultural communication. Assess in summative assessments for each mode too. So we're not just talking about an interpretive task and then not talking about speaking or writing at all. You need to have it consistent throughout. And then integrate across content areas, because as Carmen said, you can use this to talk about art standards or math standards, or for me in the high school level, art history and history itself. There's so many connections we can make with other content areas, and other content areas can use these standards as well.
And if you are an elementary school teacher and looking for some ideas how to implement these can-do statements, it is very easy, and it is very easy to create a home connections where your students will need to reflect what they were learning in the classroom. For example, for one of my thematic units talking about rules and comparing rules from our school and another school from another Spanish speaker country, my students took this paper, and with their parents' help, they had to answer why are rules important at a school, and if you go to another school, do you think it is important to follow its rules? So to keep them thinking about those perspectives as well.
So we've shared a lot of ideas from the elementary and secondary perspectives, but what we're really interested in is what ways have you worked to develop intercultural communicative competence in your classroom? And we would really love if you reflect on this a little bit, and in the next couple of days, as you think of an idea or a resource, or maybe you have a nice image of something you've done, add it to a Padlet that we've created. It's a collaborative Padlet, and that way we not only can we see your ideas, but you can share them with each other and really get that network that we're missing because of COVID this year. So please consider adding to this Padlet, and you can use it as a resource as we go.
So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much for your time spending with us.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.